The boy's words cut through the silence of the kitchen like a blade through river water, soft and devastating all at once. "You smell like rain and bread," little Eli said, his face pressed against Louise Shepard's flour-dusted apron, his small arms wrapped around her waist with the kind of desperate grip that only a child who had known too much loss could manage. "That is what home smells like." Louise stood completely still, her hands hovering above the boy's shoulders, her heart hammering so hard she was certain it would crack a rib. She had not planned for this. She had not planned for any of this. She had not planned for the way those 7 words would reach into her chest and rearrange everything inside her. She had certainly not planned on falling in love with this child's father. August Langston stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, hat in hand, dust from the trail still clinging to his collar, and he watched his 5-year-old son say the thing that August himself had not found the courage to say in 4 months. The expression on his face was the most terrifying thing Louise had ever witnessed, because it was not anger or indifference or the cold, shuttered look men wore when they were protecting themselves. It was raw. It was open. It was a man standing at the edge of something enormous and deciding whether to jump. Louise finally let her hand settle onto Eli's back, and she looked up at August across the width of that kitchen, and the world outside stopped its reckless spinning for just one moment. She had come to Laramie, Wyoming territory, in the spring of 1879 under circumstances that nobody in this town fully understood, carrying secrets she had every intention of keeping. She had come here running from something dark and hidden, something that wore the face of a respectable man back in Missouri and had nearly destroyed her. She had not come here to find a home. She had not come here to become the thing a lonely child reached for when the world felt too large and too cold. And she had absolutely, under no circumstances, come here to fall in love with a widowed rancher with haunted eyes and a jaw set so hard it looked carved from the red clay of the Wyoming hills. But here she stood, smelling of rain and bread, holding a child who had just named the thing she had been too afraid to claim. 4 months earlier, on a gray February morning when the wind off the Laramie range could skin a man alive, Louise Shepard had stepped off the westbound Union Pacific train with one carpetbag, $43 tucked into her boot, and a letter of employment from a woman named Clara Booth, who ran the only respectable boarding house in Laramie. Clara needed a cook and a housekeeper. Louise needed to disappear. She had been a cook in Missouri, in the house of a man named Harlan Voss, who was a banker and a deacon, and who had, over the course of 2 years, made Louise's life a quiet and systematic trap. He had hired her when she was 24, fresh off a farm outside of Springfield after her parents died of typhoid within 6 days of each other. He had been courtly and measured at first, the way dangerous men often are. He had let the trap close slowly, incrementally, until Louise woke one morning and realized that her wages were being held in an account she could not access, that her movements were being watched, that the other servants in the house had been replaced one by one with people loyal to Voss, and that the story he had begun telling around town about Louise Shepard was a dark past she had not lived and could not disprove. The story he told was that she had stolen from her previous employer, that she had a habit of deception, that she was a woman of hidden motives and unreliable character. He told this story so that no one would believe her if she ran. He told it as a collar and a leash. Louise ran anyway. She had $43 and a recipe for sourdough bread her mother had taught her when she was 8 years old, and she decided those 2 things were enough to start a life on. Clara Booth's boarding house was a 2-story clapboard building on 2nd Street, drafty in winter and sweltering in summer, and it smelled permanently of boiled coffee and pipe tobacco, and the particular loneliness of men who were far from wherever they had begun. Louise took a room in the attic and began cooking meals that made grown men go quiet in a way that food had not made them quiet in years. She made stews with whatever Clara's budget allowed, thick with whatever root vegetables the general store had in stock. She made cornbread and biscuits, and on Fridays she made pies from dried apple and whatever else she could stretch and coax into something that tasted like abundance. And every morning, without fail, she made bread. Sourdough, the way her mother had taught her, feeding the starter each evening, punching the dough each morning, letting it rise in the thin Wyoming warmth. The smell of it had become the smell of the boarding house, and the men who boarded there had stopped being anonymous shadows in her peripheral vision and had started saying good morning to her by name. She had been there 3 weeks when August Langston first came through the door. He was not looking for a meal. He was looking for Clara, because Clara's boarding house also served as the unofficial message center for the ranching community outside of town, and Clara kept a corkboard in the front room where letters and notices were pinned and held until claimed. August came in on a Thursday, hat pulled low, and Louise was in the front room laying a fire because the temperature had dropped overnight, and the flu in the front parlor had a habit of reluctance. She heard the door open and she did not look up from the grate. "Morning," August said. "Morning," Louise said to the fireplace. There was the sound of him moving to the corkboard, the soft rustle of paper, then quiet. Then, after a moment, he said, "You made that bread." It was not a question. Louise did look up then, because there was something in his voice that was not flirtation and not dismissal, and was something she had not expected from a man she had never seen before. It was recognition. The way a person sounds when they encounter something they thought they had lost. She saw him clearly for the first time. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way that came from actual labor rather than posturing, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were a deep, complicated gray. He had a jawline that looked like it had been set against some difficulty and never entirely relaxed since. He looked like a man who slept poorly and worked hard and did not ask anyone for anything he thought he could manage alone. He was holding a piece of paper from the corkboard, but he was not reading it. "I made the bread," Louise confirmed. "My wife used to make sourdough," he said, and then he seemed to hear what he had said, and something in his face closed up quickly, the way a window shuts against rain. Louise did not know about the wife then. She would learn about Ellen Langston later, from Clara, who knew everything about everyone within 50 miles. Ellen had died 14 months earlier in childbirth, the baby born still, and she had left behind August and their 4-year-old son, Eli, and a grief so massive and structural that it had become the architecture of everything August did and did not do. On that Thursday morning, Louise simply said, "I am sorry for your loss," because it was clear one had occurred, and August gave her a single short nod and left with his letter. He came back the next Thursday, and the Thursday after that. He always had a reason. There was always a letter to collect, or a piece of equipment to pick up from the hardware store next door, or information Clara might have about road conditions or cattle prices. Louise did not examine these reasons too closely, because she was not yet permitting herself to be interested in anything beyond the daily mechanics of staying employed and staying hidden. But she noticed things. She noticed that he always arrived in the morning when the bread was fresh. She noticed that he sometimes stood in the doorway of the kitchen on some pretext, talking to Clara about ranching business, and that his eyes moved to the bread on the counter, with an expression she could not name but recognized as a kind of longing that had nothing to do with hunger. She noticed that his boy, Eli, sometimes came with him, riding ahead on a small pony named Buckwheat, and that Eli was the most serious-faced 5-year-old she had ever encountered, with his father's gray eyes and a quality of watchfulness that broke her heart a little every time she saw it. The boy who watched the world like he expected it to take something else from him. In March, Clara asked Louise if she would be willing to take on extra work. There was a rancher outside of town, Clara said carefully, a good man, honest man, who was struggling considerably with the domestic management of his household, since his housekeeper had left to marry a farrier in Cheyenne. He had a young son who needed regular meals and a clean house and someone reliable, and he was willing to pay fairly for 2 days a week. Louise had known immediately who Clara meant. She had sat with it for a day, and told herself all the sensible reasons why this was a professional arrangement and nothing more, and then she had said yes. The Langston Ranch was 8 miles east of Laramie, at the foot of a long, gentle slope with a creek running through the eastern corner of the property. The house was a solid, practical structure, well built, and currently in the particular state of disorder that descends upon a household when the person who managed it is no longer there. August Langston was a man who could mend a fence line in freezing rain and birth a calf in the dark without panic, but the domestic half of life had apparently been so thoroughly Ellen's territory that he had not known where to begin reclaiming it. The first day Louise arrived, she found a kitchen where someone had been attempting to cook, but had given up at various points, with evidence of half-finished efforts on every surface. She found Eli sitting at the kitchen table eating cold cornmeal from a bowl with the focused determination of a child who was making no complaint, because he had decided complaints were not useful. He looked up at her with those watchful gray eyes and said, "Pa said you are going to cook for us." "I am," Louise said. "Can you make bread?" he asked. She had made bread. She had made it that first day, alongside a proper meal, and she had given Eli the job of punching down the dough because Clara had once told her that children who were given useful tasks felt less adrift in a difficult world, and this child looked like he had been adrift for a very long time. Eli had punched the dough with great seriousness, and wiped his floury hands on his trousers, and announced that it smelled good. He had eaten 3 pieces at dinner and said nothing else, but he had sat close to the bread while he ate, like it was a small warm fire. August had come in from the evening chores, washed at the pump outside, and eaten the meal she set before him in a silence that was not unfriendly but was dense with things unsaid. He had looked at the bread on the table the way he had looked at it through Clara's doorway with that complicated expression, and Louise had busied herself at the stove so she would not have to watch him feel it. He had said at the end, "Thank you, Miss Shepard. This is more than I asked for." "I cook what I cook," she had said simply. That had been the beginning. Over the following weeks, the rhythm of Louise's 2 days at the Langston Ranch became the rhythm around which everything else in her week arranged itself. She did not examine this too carefully. She told herself it was simply that the work was satisfying, which it was. The house responded to care the way a neglected animal responds to kindness, and there was something deeply settling about bringing order to a place that needed it. She told herself it was Eli she was coming back for, which was also true. The boy had begun to uncoil slowly in her presence, like a fist opening. By the 3rd week he was following her around the kitchen asking questions about everything she did, and by the 4th week he was telling her things, small things at first, about buckwheat and about a rock he had found by the creek that looked like a turtle, and then gradually larger things, about his friend Tommy Birch from in town, and about his mother. He told her about Ellen the way children tell things, in fragments, without apparent awareness of the weight they were handing over. He said his mother had been very tall and had laughed loud. He said she had made his nightshirts herself, and that she had smelled like lavender. He said sometimes he forgot her face and that made his chest hurt. Louise had listened to all of this while she worked, responding carefully, honestly, not trying to fill the space that Ellen occupied but not pretending it wasn't there. "It is allowed to miss her," Louise told him one afternoon in April when the sun was coming through the kitchen window at a low angle, and the bread was baking and the whole house smelled warm. "Missing someone means they were real and they mattered. That is a good thing to carry." Eli had thought about this for a long time, with his gray eyes focused on the middle distance. Then he had nodded in the decisive way he had, like he was filing the information correctly, and asked her if she could teach him how to braid dough the way she sometimes did for the fancy loaves. She had taught him. His braids were lopsided and enthusiastic, and they tasted perfect. August had seen the braided loaf on the table that evening and looked at his son, and then at Louise with an expression that moved through something close to pain before settling into something she did not yet have a word for. He had said very quietly, "He did that." "He did," Louise said. August had said nothing else, but he had put his hand briefly on top of his son's head, just once, the gesture of a man who loved enormously and had not yet learned how to say so again. April became May, and the Wyoming spring arrived the way it always did in that territory, reluctantly, with cold nights persisting stubbornly even as the days grew longer and the hills began to show patches of green. Louise planted a kitchen garden in the plot beside the house because it was a practical thing to do, and not because she was becoming invested in the future of this place. She told herself this firmly while she was on her knees in the dirt putting in carrot seed and onion sets. Eli helped with the garden the way he helped with everything, which was to say with total commitment and a great many questions. He wanted to know why carrots grew underground and tomatoes didn't, and Louise explained pollination and root vegetables as best she could, and Eli absorbed everything with his characteristic gravity and then said, "So the carrot is keeping a secret from above the ground." "I suppose you could say that," Louise said, smiling. "Like people," Eli said. Louise had gone very still in the garden dirt. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully. Eli shrugged with one shoulder in the way he had borrowed from his father. "Pa says some people keep parts of themselves underground so they do not get hurt. He says it is okay to do that for a while." Louise thought about Harlan Voss in Missouri and the parts of herself she had buried deep and the $43 in the boot and the quiet ongoing terror of being found. She thought about how she had been here nearly 3 months and had not yet told anyone the whole truth of why she had come. "Your pa is a wise man," she said. "He does not talk much, though," Eli said. "He is wiser when he is not talking." Louise had laughed at that, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and Eli had looked profoundly pleased with himself. She had been laughing when August came around the corner of the house to check on the garden's progress, and he had stopped at the sound of it, and Louise had turned and found him watching her with those gray eyes holding something she was not ready to name. She had looked away first. May deepened into June, and the days grew long and hot and the creek ran lower, and Louise found reasons to stay later on her 2 days than was strictly necessary. There was always something. The jam needed finishing. The mending was not quite done. Eli had a loose button on his good shirt that ought to be sewn before Sunday. She was lying to herself and she knew it, but the alternative was to go back to the boarding house and its permanent smell of loneliness and sit with the truth of what was happening to her, and she was not yet ready. The truth was that August Langston had begun to talk. It had happened gradually, incrementally, the way the light changes in Wyoming before a storm, a gradual shift from closed to something approaching open. He had started staying in the kitchen after dinner on her second day each week rather than going immediately to the evening work. He had started asking her things. Small things at first, practical things about the garden and the house, then larger things. He asked her where she had learned to cook. She told him about her mother, about the farm in Missouri, and he listened in a way that was very still and very complete, as though listening were itself a form of respect. He asked her what had brought her to Wyoming, and she gave him the partial answer she had given everyone, that she had needed a change and a new position, and he had accepted this without pressing, but she had caught in his eyes a flicker of something that told her he suspected there was more, and was choosing not to demand it. She appreciated that more than she could say. She asked him about Ellen, one evening in early June, because it seemed wrong to keep walking around the edges of something so central. She had asked simply and directly, the way she did things, and August had been quiet for a long time before he answered. He told her that Ellen had been his childhood sweetheart, that they had grown up in the same town in Nebraska and come west together when they were both 22, full of the particular kind of confidence that belongs to people who have not yet been taught humility by catastrophe. He told her that Ellen had loved this land with a completeness that still amazed him to think about, that she had been the one who had wanted to build the ranch and build it here and had driven that vision with a determination that made everything possible. He said, "She had plans. She always had plans. I was the one who could build the thing, but she was the one who knew what it ought to be. He said, when she died, I did not know how to want anything for a while. I knew how to work, so I worked. I knew how to take care of Eli, so I did that. But wanting something was gone for a long time. He had been looking at the table when he said this, and Louise had been very careful not to look at him because she was afraid of what her face might be doing. And now, she had asked quietly. He had been silent for a long moment. Then he had said, I am beginning to remember what it feels like. The room had held its breath. Louise had stood up and begun clearing the dishes with great efficiency, and August had gone out to see to the horses, and that had been the end of that conversation. But it had taken up residence inside her and would not leave. She did not sleep well that night. She told herself all the reasons why this was complicated and dangerous and inadvisable. She was here under circumstances she had not fully disclosed. She was here because she was hiding, and she was hiding from a man with money and connections, and a narrative about her character that he had spent 2 years constructing. She was not a safe person for a man with a child to invest his heart in, because she did not know what Harlan Voss was capable of when he decided to come after what he considered his property. And she knew, with a cold certainty that had been growing since the day she ran, that he would eventually come after her. A man like Harlan Voss did not let go of things he considered his. She had been 3 months in Laramie, and she had told herself every week that she should move on, go further west, get to California or Oregon, where she could lose herself more completely. Every week she had stayed because of the bread and the boarding house and Clara's kindness, and the garden she had planted and the boy with the gray eyes. She was staying for a child, and she was in danger of staying for his father, and she was not certain which of those facts frightened her more. In the second week of June, Louise was at the boarding house early on a Monday morning, managing the breakfast service, when the man walked in. She knew him before she consciously recognized him. Her body knew him the way prey recognizes a predator, a cold flooding sensation that began in her stomach and moved outward. She was carrying a coffee pot, and she went very still in the middle of the dining room. He was not Harlan Voss. He was Voss's man, a person named Clement, who had worked for Voss as a kind of all-purpose agent for years. Clement was a lean, colorless man with small eyes and the unhurried patience of someone being paid well for his time. He came into the boarding house dining room and took a seat and looked around with those small eyes, and Louise turned before his gaze reached her and walked back to the kitchen and set the coffee pot down on the stove with great care. She stood very still for 30 seconds. Then she untied her apron, folded it, laid it on the work table, picked up her small purse, and walked out the back door. She went to the post office first and sent a letter to a woman she knew in Denver who might be able to confirm whether Voss had filed any legal documents against her. Then she went to the general store and bought enough flour and salt and a small quantity of lard to be useful and practical, because her hands needed something to do while her mind worked through the problem. The problem was this: Clement was here, which meant Voss knew where she was. Which meant the hidden, carefully constructed safety of the past 3 months was over, which meant she had to make a decision. She walked. She walked through the center of Laramie and out along the road east without fully intending to, and it was 2 miles before she looked up and realized where she was going. The Langston Ranch. It was not one of her days. She had no reason to be here. She stood on the road, looking at the gate with the L-bar brand worked into the iron of it, and felt the full complicated weight of everything she had not said. August was working the near pasture, mending the fence line along the creek, and he saw her from a distance and straightened and watched her come through the gate with an expression that shifted quickly from surprise to attention, the focused attention of a man who recognizes that something is wrong. "Miss Shepard," he said when she was close enough. He had taken his hat off. "Are you all right?" Louise stood in the Wyoming sunshine with her sack of flour and her sack of lard and said, "I need to tell you something. Several things, and I understand completely if after I tell you you prefer I not come back here." He was very still. "All right," he said. "I came to Laramie because I was running from something," she said. "Not from the law. I have not done anything illegal. But there is a man in Missouri named Harlan Voss who employs me and who, I believe, has been spreading a false reputation about me to prevent me from finding work elsewhere, as a way of keeping me. I took money from his household to leave. The money was my wages that he was withholding, but he may not characterize it that way." She said it all at once, in order, without looking away from him. August was very quiet for a long moment. "How long has he been doing this?" he asked, not what she had expected. "The withholding, approximately a year. The false reputation, I believe he began constructing it shortly after I started working for him. He is a systematic man." "Is he dangerous?" She considered this honestly. "He is a man who is accustomed to controlling things. I do not know whether he would resort to direct violence. I know that he has sent someone here. I saw the man this morning." August looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was working through a problem. Then he said, "Come inside." She followed him to the house. He made coffee, which surprised her, because she had never seen him make coffee before, and poured it and set a cup in front of her and sat across the table with his own cup and said, "Tell me the rest of it." So she did. All of it. From the beginning, from the farm in Missouri and her parents dying and the job with Voss and the gradual tightening of the trap. She told it carefully and without excess, the way she did things, and August listened in that complete and respectful way of his, not interrupting, not flinching, just listening. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The $40 you started with." "43, she said. "You came out here with $43 and a recipe and you started over." "I did." He looked at her across the table with those gray eyes, and there was something in them that looked remarkably like admiration. "That took considerable courage," he said. Louise had not expected that either. She had expected judgment or concern that dissolved into distance, or the particular discomfort men showed when a woman's trouble was bigger than they had signed on for. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "You told me when it became necessary," he said. "I understand why you didn't before." He sat for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. Then he said, "I know a man here in Laramie. His name is Sam Garrett. He is a deputy marshal and he is a trustworthy man. You ought to speak to him about this Voss and what he has done. The wage withholding especially. There are legal remedies." "I do not have proof," Louise said. "No documents. Your own account is proof. And if Voss has sent someone to follow you across 3 states, that is evidence of behavior that will not look well for him in front of a territorial judge." He paused. "May I come with you when you speak to Garrett?" "Not to speak for you, just to be there." Louise looked at this man who had listened to the worst and most complicated thing about her and had responded by offering to stand beside her, and felt something unlock in her chest that had been bolted shut for a very long time. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." They went to see Sam Garrett that afternoon, while Eli was at school in town. Garrett was a compact, steady man in his late 30s with the permanently alert eyes of someone who had spent years making assessments of people quickly and accurately. He listened to Louise's account, asked precise and useful questions, and made notes. He told her that he could not arrest Clement for simply being in Laramie, but that he could make the man aware that he was known to the law and that any interference with Louise would be met accordingly. He told her that he would write to his counterpart in Springfield, Missouri, about Harlan Voss and the wage withholding, and that he had seen this pattern before, men of means using fabricated reputations as a form of control, and that it did not always go the way those men expected when it came before an authority. He told Louise to come to him immediately if Clement approached her or made any threat. Walking back out into the June afternoon, Louise felt the first loosening of the fear she had been carrying since she ran. Not gone, but less absolute. August walked beside her and said nothing until they reached the place where the road divided toward the boarding house, and then he stopped and said, "You should not be alone in that attic room while this is unresolved." Louise looked at him. "Clara has a ground-floor room," he said. "Ask her about it. And in the meantime, if you are willing, you could take your meals out at the ranch. It is not an inappropriate suggestion. I have a son and a housekeeper, and there is nothing in it that any person could object to." He was trying very hard to be practical and sensible about this, and the effort was visible, and it was one of the things that made him so entirely different from every man she had encountered in the past 2 years, the visible effort toward decency. "I will ask Clara about the room," Louise said. "Thank you, for today, for all of it." "You do not need to thank me for behaving like a reasonable human being," he said. "You would be surprised," she said, "how rare that is." He looked at her for a moment, and something passed between them that was too large and too specific for the street outside the marshal's office, and then they both looked away, and the moment became the next moment, which was ordinary and manageable. But it had happened. It sat in Louise like a new kind of warmth, something she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten it was possible to feel it. She moved to the ground floor room. She continued her 2 days a week at the ranch. Sam Garrett had a quiet conversation with Clement, apparently quite definitive in nature, because Clement was gone from Laramie by the following morning. Garrett wrote to Springfield. The reply came in 3 weeks and was, as Garrett had predicted, illuminating. Harlan Voss had in fact filed a civil complaint against Louise in Missouri, alleging theft, but the details of the complaint were inconsistent in ways that suggested fabrication, and Garrett's counterpart in Springfield was willing to investigate the wage withholding. Louise read the letter in Garrett's office and felt the ground under her become solid in a way it had not been since she was 22 on her parents' farm. She walked directly to the ranch, even though it was not her day, and she walked through the door without knocking and stood in the kitchen and breathed in the smell of the bread she had baked the day before, still faintly in the air. And then she sat down at the table and put her face in her hands and cried, very quietly, for about 3 minutes. When she looked up, August was in the doorway. He had heard her come in and had come to the kitchen from the yard and was standing very still, watching her with an expression that was careful and open and thoroughly unguarded. "Good news or bad?" he asked quietly. "Good," she said. "I think it is going to be all right." He came into the kitchen then and sat down across from her, and he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and neither of them said anything, and it was the most intimate moment Louise had experienced in years, that simple, warm steadiness of his hand, and she did not pull away. They sat like that for a long time, with the June afternoon doing its slow burn outside the windows, and eventually Eli came home from school and came into the kitchen with his lunchbox and found them sitting at the table together and said, with the directness of a child who had been watching the world carefully for a long time, "Are you staying for dinner, Miss Shepard?" "Yes," Louise said. "I think I am." Eli nodded in his decisive way, satisfied, and took his lunchbox to the counter and began methodically extracting its contents. And August and Louise looked at each other across the table with their hands still touching, and the slow, careful inevitability of something that had been growing in the dark finally beginning to reach toward the light. July came in hot and fierce the way Wyoming July did, with the afternoon sky building into thunderheads over the mountains, and the evenings bringing that particular smell, the dry earth giving up its heat as the air cooled, the sage and the grass, and the rain that was coming before it arrived. Louise had made bread that morning, her regular Wednesday morning bread, and she had been caught out by the afternoon storm, one of those fast, hard Wyoming storms that materialized with very little warning, while she was coming back from the creek where she had gone to pick watercress. She had stood under a cottonwood at the edge of the creek, while the rain came down in sheets, and the lightning walked across the hills and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was not fear and not watchfulness but was purely and simply alive. She had come back to the house soaked through and laughing a little at herself, and August had been on the porch watching the storm, and he had seen her coming across the yard in the rain and had come down off the porch to meet her. "You are soaked," he said. "I am," she agreed. I did not outrun it. He had handed her a towel from the porch rail where it had been drying, and she had wrapped it around her shoulders, and they had stood on the porch together watching the rain come down and the lightning move away east, and August had said, "I need to say something to you." "All right," she said. "I am not good at saying things," he said. "I am aware of this." Ellen used to say that I communicated primarily through doing things which she found alternately endearing and infuriating. Louise almost smiled. "I have noticed," she said. "I have been not saying something for approximately 2 months," he said, "and I am going to say it now before I construct another reason not to." He was looking out at the rain, not at her, and the side of his jaw was doing the set thing, and his hands on the porch railing were very deliberate. "I am in love with you," he said. "I did not intend it. I do not think it serves as any kind of complaint. I am simply telling you because it is true and because you deserve to know the truth of things from people in your life, and you have not always had that." Louise stood very still in the towel. "I am not asking anything of you," he said. "I am not asking you to change your situation or your plans or to stay if you do not want to stay. I am only telling you because it is honest." He was still looking at the rain. "August," she said. He turned to look at her then, and she looked at him, this man who had listened and stayed and stood beside her, and planted his hand over hers across a table, and taught himself to make coffee and fixed every fence on his property, and loved his son with the fierce, quiet devotion of someone who had been broken down to the foundations and was still standing. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been not saying it also." The look on his face was something she would carry for the rest of her life. He said very quietly, "I was not certain you would be, after Missouri, after what was done to you." "I was not certain I would be either," she said honestly. "But here I am." The rain came down around the porch, and the lightning was distant now, and the smell of the wet earth rose around them. And August reached up and touched her face with one hand, just briefly, the way you touch something that you have been afraid you would not be permitted to touch, and Louise turned her cheek into his palm for a moment before he lowered his hand. It was not a kiss. It was more fundamental than that. It was two people recognizing each other across the distance that history and damage had put between them, and deciding to cross it. August made dinner that evening. It was not a sophisticated meal. It was beans and salt pork and the leftover bread from the morning, but he had made it deliberately, because Louise had told him she cooked to take care of people, and tonight he wanted to take care of her. She had sat at the kitchen table and watched him navigate his own kitchen with the careful competence of a man who knew how to do hard things, and felt a warm certainty in her chest that had no anxiety in it. Eli had eaten his beans with great efficiency and then looked at his father and then at Louise and then said, "Are you and Miss Shepard getting married?" August had put down his spoon. Louise had picked up her coffee cup. "That is not a question for dinner," August said. "Tommy Birch's father says you and Miss Shepard are going to get married," Eli said. "He told Tommy and Tommy told me." "Tommy Birch's father should concern himself with his own domestic arrangements," August said. Eli considered this. "I think it would be a good thing," he said with finality, and returned to his beans. Louise and August did not look at each other for the remainder of dinner, which they managed only with great effort. But that night, walking out to the wagon to drive back to town, Louise had looked up at the Wyoming stars, which were overwhelming in their quantity and their clarity, and felt the word yes, sitting comfortably inside her, easy and warm and entirely without doubt. August had come to the wagon to hand her up, the way he always did, a gesture of courtesy so habitual she had stopped registering it as anything except that it made her feel cared for. But tonight he held her hand a moment longer than necessary, and she held his a moment longer back. "Come to dinner on Sunday," he said, "not as the housekeeper, as a guest." "I will come," she said. He stood in the yard and watched her drive away down the lane, and she could see him in the fading light growing smaller in the distance, and she did not let herself look back more than once, which required restraint she had not previously known she possessed. Sunday dinner was, technically, a simple thing. Louise had arrived with a pie she had made at Clara's kitchen, a proper dried apple pie with a lattice top, because she needed to do something with her hands for the 2 days before Sunday arrived. August had made a roast, an actual roast, which had taken all morning and significant concentration, and Eli had set the table with an impressive attention to detail that suggested he had been instructed in this and taken the instruction seriously. They ate in the afternoon light, the three of them at the table, and it felt like something that had always been true and had just been waiting for the circumstances to confirm it. After dinner, after Eli had been sent to play outside, August had asked Louise to walk with him, and they had walked along the creek in the long summer evening, and he had told her about his plans for the ranch, the eastern pasture he wanted to open up, the second barn he had been considering, and Louise had told him about what she thought of the garden and what it could produce and what else they might plant for next year. And they had walked and talked for an hour and a half in the summer dusk like two people who had been doing this for years and fully intended to keep doing it forever. He had kissed her at the end of that walk. Standing at the edge of the creek where the cottonwoods leaned their shadows over the water, August had turned to her and said her name, Louise, just her name, and then kissed her very carefully and very completely, with both his hands holding her face the way she was something that mattered enormously, and she had kissed him back with everything she had been not saying for 4 months. And the creek went on running below them, and the sky above them went from gold to violet to dark, and neither of them moved for a very long time. He asked her to marry him in August, on the first day of the month, which she thought was characteristic of a man who found an economy in things, and apparently this included symbolism. He asked her in the kitchen, of all places, which she later decided was entirely right. He asked her while she was making bread, which was where she had always been most herself, and he came in from the morning work and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "I would like to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you answer I will not make it difficult." She had kept her hands in the dough. "Ask," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because of Eli, though I know he would be glad of it. Not because of the ranch or the practicalities or anything that is not this. Because I love you and I want to be married to you, and I want to know that you will be here." Louise had her hands in the bread dough and her heart in her throat and the whole long, complicated year behind her. The grief of her parents and the trap of Voss and the $43 and the train across the prairie and the boarding house, and the first morning she had seen August Langston and not looked up from the fireplace, and she felt all of it compress and clarify into this one warm exact morning in this kitchen she had brought back to life, and she said, without any of the hesitation she had expected to feel, yes. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and kissed her, flour and all, and she laughed against his mouth. And it was not a refined or dramatic moment. It was better than that. It was real and warm and smelled of bread. They told Eli at breakfast. His response was to look at his father, then at Louise, and then to say, "I told you so," with a satisfaction that was profoundly superior and thoroughly earned. August had looked at his son with an expression of fond exasperation. "You are 5 years old," he said. "I am almost 6, Eli said, and I was right." August and Louise were married in September at the Laramie church. A simple ceremony with Clara Booth and Sam Garrett as witnesses and Eli, standing beside his father in his good shirt with the button Louise had sewn back on in May, looking like the most earnest and satisfied wedding guest in the history of Wyoming territory. Louise wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself from cloth she had bought at the general store, and August wore his good jacket and a new hat, and looked at her when she came down the aisle of that small church with an expression of complete and unguarded love that made Clara Booth press her handkerchief to her eyes. The justice of the peace read the words and Louise and August said the words back, and Eli held very still with tremendous effort, and when it was done August kissed her, and this time it was not careful and contained but full and warm, and the whole church felt it. They walked out into the September afternoon as a family. The words settled into Louise with a warmth and a weight that was nothing like the trap, and everything like the thing she had been moving toward since she was a girl on her parents' farm learning to make bread. That evening, with Eli asleep, August and Louise sat on the porch together in the cool September night, her leaning into his side, his arm around her, the stars the same as they always were and everything else entirely different. "Are you afraid?" he asked her, because he asked her real things. "No," she said, and it was the truth. "Are you?" "A little," he said. "I did not think I would have this again. I am afraid of being too careful with it." "You are allowed to hold it," she said. "Good things can be held." He pulled her closer, and she felt the warmth of him against the cool air and the September smell of the drying grass and the first hint of what was coming, winter coming down from the mountains, the whole long season of staying in. "I like the idea of staying in," Louise said. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said, smiling. "Just thinking." The matter of Harlan Voss resolved itself in October, as Sam Garrett had believed it would. The civil complaint was examined and dismissed. The investigation in Springfield resulted in a judgment against Voss for the withheld wages, which were to be remitted to Louise through Garrett's office. The amount was more than she had expected, the accumulation of a year's suppression. She received it and stood at Garrett's desk holding the draft and felt the last of the hidden fear drain away like water through cracked ground. She used part of it to buy glass for the kitchen window she had been meaning to repair, and a proper iron stove to replace the worn one, because the kitchen deserved it, and she used the rest to start an account at the Laramie bank in the name of Louise Langston, which she did with a quiet deliberateness that was its own declaration of freedom. The winter that year was hard, the way Wyoming winters were, with the kind of cold that came through walls you thought were solid, and the snow that drifted to the tops of fences, and the days where going out to tend the animals required the full application of every layer of clothing available. Louise had not experienced this kind of winter before, and she met it with the same practical attention she brought to everything. She and Eli spent the long indoor days with a regularity and a richness that she found she loved entirely. She taught him things, not only cooking but letters and arithmetic, and the history she knew from the books she had brought from Missouri, and added to from the small Laramie lending library. He was a sharp student with a voracious curiosity that had been waiting for material to work on, and she took deep satisfaction in watching him absorb and question and grow. August came in from the cold work each evening to a warm house with supper on the stove and his son full of things to tell him and his wife, and that word had not grown ordinary to him. The word still caught something in his chest each time he used it, his wife beside him or across from him, or standing in the kitchen in the lamplight, and he thought sometimes about the particular mercy of second chances. He had not thought he deserved one. He had not expected one. And here she was, Louise, in the kitchen he had once stood in while the whole world felt like a hole, making bread that smelled like everything that was worth holding on to. In December, near Christmas, Eli got a fever. It was the kind of thing that happened to children in winter, a respiratory illness that moved through the territory every year and was usually manageable and occasionally was not. And for 4 days, Louise did not leave Eli's room for more than the time it took to get broth from the kitchen or clean water from the pump. August sat with him at night. They traded off, sleeping in the chair beside the bed, feeding him weak broth and cool compresses, measuring the fever's progress with a mother's and a father's constant calculation. On the 4th night the fever broke. Louise was sitting in the chair when it happened, holding Eli's hand, and she felt the moment the temperature shifted, felt his small body release something and go soft and cool, and she put her forehead down on the side of the bed beside his hand and cried with the enormous relief of it. August came in at dawn and found her like that, and Eli still asleep and cooling and breathing normally, and he crossed the room and put both his arms around Louise from behind and held her without speaking, and she reached up and held his arms, and they stayed like that while the winter light came through the frost on the window. When Eli woke up, he was weak and hungry and entirely himself, and he asked for bread and broth and then for Louise to read to him. And she read for 2 hours while August did the morning chores with a lightness in his step that the frozen yard could not diminish. That afternoon, half dozing against his pillow while Louise sat beside him, Eli said, very quietly and somewhat drowsily, "You smell like rain and bread." Louise looked at him. "That is what home smells like," he said, and closed his eyes and slept. And that was the moment. That was the moment August came back into the room and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and his heart in his face, and heard his son say the thing that compressed the whole year into a single sentence. And Louise looked up and met his eyes across the room with her own eyes full. And everything that had ever been difficult and hidden and frightening became, in that moment, simply the path that had led here. August came into the room and sat on the edge of the bed beside Eli and beside Louise, and he took her hand. And Eli slept between them, and the winter afternoon light lay across all three of them like something given freely. Christmas that year was the best of all their Christmases, as far as Louise was concerned, and she had not even had holidays to compare it to for several years. She made a Christmas pudding from a recipe she found in a magazine, and August brought in a small pine from the hills, and Eli decorated it with the paper ornaments they made together over 3 evenings at the kitchen table. And on Christmas morning they exchanged simple gifts: a new knife for August, a hair comb for Louise, and for Eli, a carved wooden horse that August had been secretly working on in the barn for 2 months, with the level of craft he brought to everything he built. Eli had held the horse in both hands with an expression that was Eli's equivalent of overwhelming emotion, which meant his mouth went very tight and his eyes went very bright, and he looked at the horse for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "It looks like buckwheat." "It does," August said. "You made it yourself," Eli said. "I did." Eli held the horse to his chest and said, "Into it." "Thank you, Pa," and August put his arm around his son, and they sat like that on the floor by the small decorated pine, while Louise watched them from the kitchen doorway with the kind of happiness that is too large and too complete to be called simply happiness. The new year came in, and the winter deepened and then began, very slowly, to ease. February brought warmer days alternating with fierce late storms, and March was a battle between winter and spring that spring eventually won. And by April the hills were greening again, and the creek was running full with snowmelt, and the kitchen garden needed to be turned and replanted. In late April, Louise told August that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, over coffee, sitting across the table from him the way they sat most mornings. She said it directly and simply, the way she did things, and watched his face. What she saw was a complex thing that moved through fear, the shadow of the last time, and then through something that was working hard against the fear, and then to something genuine and warm and enormous. He said, "Are you well?" "I am well," she said. "I feel perfectly well. You will tell me if you are not." "I will tell you." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat with it for a moment, the weight and the joy of it both present, neither diminished by the other. "Eli will be insufferable," August said. "Eli will be magnificent," Louise said. He was. When they told him, Eli received the information with his characteristic gravity and then said, "I have been thinking about this." "You have," August said. "I would like it to be a brother," Eli said, "because I already know how to be around girls and boys are more interesting." "That is not how it works," August said. "I know," Eli said, "but I am mentioning it as a preference." Louise had laughed until her ribs ached. Summer came, and Louise's body changed the way it did, and she adapted her work as needed, which required some negotiation with August, who had a tendency toward protective anxiety that was deeply sincere and occasionally impractical. She was strong and healthy, and the local doctor, a capable woman named Dr. Frances Hale, who had come out from Philadelphia 3 years earlier and was still, in the view of certain people in town, an improbable fixture in the Wyoming medical landscape, was thorough and competent and reassuring. Dr. Hale came out to the ranch monthly and assessed Louise's condition, with the clinical directness of a person who had left the eastern seaboard specifically, because she was tired of people not saying the true thing, and she consistently told Louise that everything was progressing well, and that Louise was exactly the kind of physically capable person one wished to be in the territory when it came to this. August hovered. Louise was patient with him, because she understood that his fear was made of real material, and she let him hover up to the point where it became counterproductive, at which point she told him plainly to go fix something, and he went and fixed things. He was better when he was building. He put up the second barn that summer, the one he had been planning since before she arrived, and he added a room to the east side of the house, a proper addition with its own fireplace, because the house needed it and because something in him needed the act of building toward the future. The baby was born in November. A boy, healthy and red-faced and loud in his arrival, which was, all things considered, an enormous relief that went through the room in a wave of released breath and weeping, and a particular quality of thanksgiving that went beyond articulation. August had been present, as she had wanted, and he had held her hand through all of it, and when Dr. Hale put the baby in Louise's arms, August sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with the same expression she had seen that first morning in Clara's boarding house doorway: recognition, something he had thought he had lost. Eli came in, having waited with what must have been truly extraordinary difficulty given his general disposition toward immediacy, and looked at the baby with great seriousness. "It is a boy," he said. "It is," August said. Eli leaned in and studied the baby carefully. "He looks like a potato," he said. "All newborns do," Louise said. "He will improve," Eli decided magnanimously, and reached out one careful finger and touched the baby's hand, and the baby's fingers closed around his with that automatic infant grip, and Eli's face changed in a way none of them had seen before, something wholly unguarded and young, something that was simply and purely joy. "He held my finger," Eli said very quietly. "He did," Louise said. Eli stayed like that for a long time, with his finger in his brother's fist, looking at the baby's face with an expression of absolute, total love. They named him Thomas William Langston. Thomas for no particular reason except that it suited him, William for both of their fathers, who had been William Shepard and William Langston respectively, which felt like a good thread to carry forward. August called him Will from the start, and Eli called him Thomas when addressing him directly, and the baby, in all other contexts for approximately the first year. The winter after Will's birth was the warmest domestic winter of Louise's memory. The house was full in a way she had not known a house could be full of the specific sounds and rhythms of a family that was finding its particular music, the morning noise and the evening quiet, and all the gradations between. She made bread every morning still, because that was her morning thing, the ritual that grounded the day, and the smell of it moved through the house and out onto the porch where August sat with his coffee before going out to work, and he had told her once that he did not think he could explain what that smell did for him, how it had become the smell not just of her but of the whole life he had, and she had said, "You do not need to explain it. I know." She knew because Eli had already said it. She knew because that was what home smelled like. The legal matter of Harlan Voss concluded in the spring following Will's birth. The Springfield judgment was finalized, the money remitted, and Garrett received word that Voss had made no further attempts to pursue Louise, and that his reputation in Springfield had suffered considerably from the investigation, which had turned up other evidence of the same pattern extended to other women in his employ. Louise read this final letter in the kitchen while Will was sleeping in his cradle and Eli was at school, and the bread was rising on the counter, and she held it in her hands for a moment, and then folded it carefully and put it in the box where she kept important documents, and she poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down and thought about all the women who had been in the same trap before her, and had not had $43 or a Western train or a town like Laramie or a man like August. And she sat with that for a long time. She told August that evening, and he listened, and said that he was glad it was done and that he intended never to think about Harlan Voss again, which was his prerogative, and Louise agreed that was the right approach. She told him also that she had been thinking about the other women, the ones still in similar situations across the country, and she had been thinking about what could be done. August had looked at her with those eyes. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I am thinking that I know things now that I did not know then," she said. "Legal things and practical things. And Clara has connections to the Women's Aid Society in Cheyenne, and Dr. Hale is on the board of a medical charity. I am not yet certain what shape it takes, but I would like to do something." August reached across the table, which was where they always did their most important communication, and took her hand. "Then we will figure out what shape it takes," he said. She loved him. She loved him with a depth and specificity that she had not known was available to her. A love that was full of clear sight, that saw his grief and his silence, and his jaw-set difficulty with saying things, and the quality of his hands and his absolute trustworthiness, and the way he loved his children with a full and present heart, and loved all of it, including the complicated and the imperfect. She believed he saw her the same way, which was the most extraordinary thing of all. Spring turned to summer, the second summer of their marriage. Eli turned 7 and had opinions about everything with an eloquence that suggested he had been practicing in private. Will was walking by summer, a determined tottering progress that usually ended in sitting down hard and looking surprised, and Eli took his responsibility as older brother with the same seriousness he brought to all matters. Louise found a rhythm of days that satisfied her in a deep and cellular way, the work of the ranch and the house and the garden, the cooking that she did not experience as labor but as expression, the evenings on the porch with August when the children were in bed, the particular quality of a Wyoming summer night, the vast sky and the smell of the cooling earth and the sound of the creek in the distance. She began, that summer, to work with Clara and Dr. Hale on what eventually became a modest but real network, connecting women in difficult employment situations with legal and practical resources, operating through the mail and through the informal communications network that Clara's boarding house had always been. It was small and imperfect and thoroughly practical, and it mattered, and Louise threw herself into it with the same capable focus she had always had. August supported all of it without qualification. "You are a person who does things," he told her once, "and I would not change that for anything." "You are also a person who does things," she said. "That is why we work." "Among other reasons," he said, with a smile, which was its own special thing because August's smiles were not common currency and therefore worth considerably more. In the autumn of that year, 2 years after their marriage, Louise learned she was expecting again. She received this news with the calm of experience and the warm happiness of a woman whose home was solid enough to hold it. She told August, and he did the same thing he had done the first time, the fear then courage then love progression on his face. And then he stood up and held her for a long time without saying anything, which was, she had come to understand, his most eloquent form of communication. Eli was informed and said, "I would like a sister this time because I understand them better than I thought." "You said brothers were more interesting," August said. "I have updated my position," Eli said with dignity. The second baby arrived in the spring, March of 1882, and was a girl, small and fierce and dark-haired, and Eli received her with a satisfaction bordering on vindication. They named her Clara Ellen Langston. Clara for the woman who had given Louise a room and a chance when she needed both. Ellen for the mother Eli carried in his chest and always would. August had suggested Ellen, and Louise had said yes without hesitation, because Ellen was real and had been loved and had built this ranch and left the world Eli in it, and she deserved to be remembered in the names of the people who came after. Eli held his sister the first time with a concentration and a tenderness that made Louise press her hand to her mouth so she would not make a sound and startle him, and he looked at the baby's dark hair and said, "She looks like Pa." "She does," Louise said. "I look like Ma," Eli said. Louise looked at him, at the gray eyes and the jaw that was going to be August's jaw in another 10 years, and said, "You look like both of them." Eli considered this. "I know," he said, in a way that held no grief and no complication, just the simple truth of it, the fact of being made from two people you loved and carrying them forward. "I know that." He handed the baby back to Louise with great care and went outside, and Louise heard him telling August about the baby's hair, his voice carrying through the open window on the March wind, clear and confident and entirely at home. The ranch in the years that followed became what Ellen had planned it to be, not through any single dramatic act, but through the slow, steady accumulation of work and investment and care. August hired 2 hands, brothers named Jerome and Calvin Reed, good workers and decent men, and expanded the herd to the eastern pasture, and built a proper stable for the horses. And the Langston Ranch became known in the territory for solid stock and honest dealing, which in those years and in that place meant everything. Louise's kitchen garden became, over the years, a proper kitchen garden that supplied a good portion of their vegetables through the summer and into the fall, and her bread had, by some organic process she had not intended, become a kind of local legend. When people came to the ranch for business, they always ended up at the kitchen table with coffee and bread, and those who came knew they would leave having been fed not just the bread but the quality of attention Louise brought to the table, which was the same quality she brought to everything. Eli grew. He was not the watchful, closed-off child of the beginning, but he retained a quality of seriousness and observation that served him well, combined now with his father's capacity for work and something of his mother Ellen's gift for vision, the ability to see what a thing could be. He was good with the ranch from an early age, with an intuitive understanding of cattle and land that August recognized and was proud of, and by the time he was 10, he was a genuine help rather than just a willing presence. Will grew into a rounder, sunnier child than his brother, quicker to laugh and quicker to move on from difficulty, with Louise's directness and a social ease that surprised and delighted everyone. He charmed the entire town of Laramie by the time he was 3, and maintained this achievement consistently thereafter. Clara grew into a girl who had her father's eyes and her mother's hands, and her own particular personality that belonged entirely to herself, which was purposeful and warm and occasionally startling in its confidence. The family grew around the kitchen table, around the bread, around the particular smell of rain, and the particular smell of yeast and warmth and fire. On a Sunday in May of 1884, 5 years after Louise had stepped off the Union Pacific train with $43 and a recipe, she stood at the kitchen window looking out at the ranch in the afternoon light. August was in the near pasture with Eli and Will, doing something with the fence, the familiar sight of them, tall man and 2 smaller figures, the kind of scene that compressed the whole meaning of a life into a single glance. Clara was asleep in the bedroom, the long, serious sleep of a 2-year-old at nap time. The kitchen smelled of bread, the sourdough she had put in the oven an hour ago, and the afternoon rain was coming. She could smell it from the open window, the sage and the earth and the electricity of it. She thought about the girl she had been on the Springfield farm, learning to fold bread dough the way her mother's hands folded it. She thought about the years in Voss's house, the slow suffocation of it. She thought about the $43 and the boot and the westbound train and the gray February morning in Laramie when she had not looked up from the fireplace. She thought about a 5-year-old boy pressing his face into her apron and saying, with complete certainty, the thing that was the most true and the most healing thing anyone had ever said to her. The kitchen door opened and August came in, dust on his boots and sun on his face, and that particular quality he always had of the ranch in his presence, the smell of grass and horses and work. He came to the window and stood beside her and looked out at the boys, who had apparently solved the fence problem and were now having some kind of discussion involving considerable gesturing from Eli and considerable skepticism from Will. "What are they arguing about?" Louise said. "The correct way to loop a wire end," August said. "Eli says one way, Will insists on the other." "Who is right?" "Eli," August said. "But Will figure that out himself, and it is better that way." Louise leaned slightly into his side and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the kitchen window together watching their children in the late afternoon light, with the rain coming and the bread in the oven and the whole long, full, improbable life around them. "5 years," she said. "Yes," he said. "I came here with $43, she said, which was something she sometimes said because she found the fact of it grounding, the reminder of how thin the margin had been and how much had been made from it. "I know," he said. "You tell me this periodically. I am proud of it," she said. "You should be," he said, and turned to press a kiss to the top of her head, unhurried and certain, the kiss of a man in a life he had chosen and would choose again. The rain came in through the open window, the first drops, and the smell of it rose up from the warming earth, and the bread behind them was almost done, the kitchen filling with that golden smell, and August held his wife in the kitchen of the house he had built and the life she had helped him find again. Outside, Will apparently conceded the wire looping debate, because Eli was visible in a stance of quiet satisfaction, and Will was demonstrating the correct technique with an exaggerated exactness that made even the serious Eli laugh, the sound of it carrying through the kitchen window on the rain-smelling air. Clara stirred in the back room, and there was the sound of small feet on the floor, the purposeful toddler walk, and then the kitchen door opened again, and Clara appeared in her sleep-rumpled state, her dark hair loose, holding the soft cloth rabbit she could not sleep without. She came directly to her parents the way she always did, and August and Louise both moved automatically, the adjustment of two people who had been doing this for years, making room for her between them, and Clara put both arms up and August picked her up, and she settled between them with the total bodily trust of a child who has never had reason to doubt she will be caught. She put her face against Louise's shoulder and breathed in, the way children breathe in what is safe. "Bread," she said, still mostly asleep. "Yes," Louise said. "Rain," Clara said. "Yes," August said. Clara settled more deeply, already going back to sleep against her mother's shoulder held by her father's arm. Outside, the rain was beginning properly, the good Wyoming rain that came fast and went fast and left everything brighter in its wake, and the boys were coming in from the pasture at a run, their voices rising and falling ahead of them, and the bread was done. Louise could tell by the smell of it, the shift from raw to complete, from promise to reality. August looked at Louise over Clara's dark head. He looked at her the way he had looked at her since the first morning he had stood in a doorway and recognized something he thought he had lost. She looked back at him the same way. There was nothing that needed to be said. There was only this kitchen and this rain and this bread and these children and this man, and the whole extraordinary fact of a life built from $43 and a recipe, and the courage to keep moving toward the thing that smelled like home. August kissed her over their sleeping daughter's head, a slow and certain kiss, and the front door burst open and Eli and Will came in from the rain arguing about something else entirely, Will's hair soaked and Eli's hat dripping, and they stopped at the sight of their parents, and Eli said, "The bread is done," with exactly the tone of a person who has been smelling bread for the past hour and has been exercising patience about it. "It is," Louise said. "Can we eat it now?" Will said. "After you hang up your wet things and wash your hands," Louise said. There was the familiar scramble of coats and hats and the pump outside running, and August set Clara gently in the chair by the warm stove where she curled and continued her sleep undisturbed, and Louise went to the oven and took out the bread, the sourdough loaf her mother had taught her, golden and firm and complete, and set it on the board to cool. The kitchen was full of rain smell and bread smell and children's voices, and the man she loved moving through it all with the ease of a person entirely at home, and Louise stood with her hands on the breadboard and looked at all of it, just looked at it for a single moment, taking it in, holding it. This was what she had been moving toward all along. Through the grief and the trap and the $43 and the long train ride west and the February morning, and the careful incremental falling in love, and the boy who had pressed his face into her apron, and said the most true thing anyone had ever said to her. This was what home smelled like. This was what home was. She cut the bread and called them all to the table, and they came.